October 732. On a road in central Francia, between Poitiers and Tours, an army stopped, not because it was destroyed, not because it ran out of men. It stopped because of one decision, made by one commander, on one cold autumn morning. And that decision would shape the map of the known world for the next 1,300 years. Here is what makes this strange. 100 years before that morning, the army that stopped had not existed. The civilization that produced it had not existed. The political structure that funded it, armed it, and pointed it north had not existed. Arabia was a peninsula that neither Rome nor Persia had ever bothered to fully conquer, because it cost more to hold than it could ever yield. In 630, Arabia was no threat to anyone. By 640, Arab armies controlled Syria, Palestine, and were moving into Egypt. By 651, Persia, an empire 400 years old, one of the great civilizations of the ancient world, had ceased to exist entirely. By 698, Roman North Africa was gone. 8 centuries of Roman presence, erased in a generation. By 711, an Arab and Berber army crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and shattered the kingdom of Spain in a single summer. By 732, their advance columns were riding through Francia. 100 years, 3 continents, no precedent in human history. This is not a story about religion. That explanation is too easy and too wrong. This is a story about 2 superpowers who spent 30 years destroying each other and left their borders unguarded. About a man named Umar who built a logistics system so efficient that his armies never had to stop moving. About a soldier named Claude who was so dangerous his own government fired him at the height of his victories, because they were afraid of what he represented. About an emperor who watched everything dissolve in 6 days beside a river and reportedly said only, "Farewell." This is a story about what happens when an unstoppable force meets a world that has already, quietly, given up. Stay with me, because before this is over, you will understand not just how 100 years of conquest happened, but why it could not go on forever. To understand what happened, you need to understand what the world looked like in 620 AD, 2 superpowers. One problem. The Byzantine Empire, Eastern Rome, controlled the Eastern Mediterranean, Greece, Anatolia, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, ancient, sophisticated Christian. Its capital, Constantinople, was the largest city in the Western world. Its politics were a blood sport. Its treasury was deep. Facing it from the east, the Sassanid Persian Empire, heir to 1,000 years of Iranian civilization. Zoroastrian, militarily formidable, culturally extraordinary. Its capital, Ctesiphon, on the Tigris River, dwarfed most European cities in scale and refinement. These 2 powers had been fighting each other for centuries. But the war that erupted in 602 was different. A Byzantine military revolt killed Emperor Maurice. Persia used the chaos as an opening. Persian armies swept through Syria. They took Palestine. They took Egypt, Rome's breadbasket for 6 centuries. They besieged Constantinople itself. For a moment, Rome looked finished. Then Heraclius arrived, a Byzantine general. He deposed the man who started the chaos, took the throne, and spent 18 years engineering one of the greatest military reversals in antiquity. He didn't fight the Persian army directly. He burned Zoroastrian sacred sites deep inside Persian territory. He attacked the empire's legitimacy from within. In 628, Persia collapsed from the inside. Khosrau was overthrown and killed by his own court. Persia sued for peace. Heraclius came home victorious. He had won. Completely. And that victory destroyed him. Because the cost was catastrophic. Syria and Palestine had been under occupation for over a decade. The Egyptian economy was wrecked. The treasury was empty. The armies were exhausted and scattered. And the taxes imposed to fund the war had poisoned Constantinople's relationship with its provincial populations, particularly in Syria and Egypt, where a theological dispute about the nature of Christ had already alienated local Christians from the imperial church long before the war began. Heraclius had won, but he had won a hollow empire. Persia was worse. Khosrau's assassination triggered political freefall. Between 628 and 632, the Persian throne changed hands 9 times. 9 emperors in 4 years. The frontier defenses, the network of client kingdoms and fortified garrisons that had kept Arabia at bay for centuries, fell apart quietly, almost without anyone noticing. Both superpowers had spent a generation fighting each other. Neither one had looked south. While Byzantium and Persia bled each other, something was forming in Arabia that had no historical precedent. Not an army, not a kingdom. Something more durable than both. Between 610 and 632, Muhammad, a merchant from Mecca, received, proclaimed, and organized a revelation that reshaped the political architecture of an entire region. By the time of his death in 632, the warring tribes of the Arabian Peninsula had been unified under a single framework of law, faith, and communal identity. Most people, when they hear this, think, religious movement. That is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Here is what actually happened at the structural level. The tribal system of Arabia was brilliant for small-scale raiding and terrible for sustained collective action. Tribes formed alliances and dissolved them. There was no permanent army, no shared treasury, no mechanism that could hold tens of thousands of men together across a multi-year military campaign. What Islam provided, and what the early caliphs systematized, was an organizational architecture that superseded tribal loyalty. Allegiance no longer went to your clan, your sheikh, your blood. It went to the ummah, the community. A political identity that could survive the death of any individual leader, that could absorb men of different tribes and different backgrounds and hold them together under a single command structure. In practical terms, an Arab-Muslim army was not a coalition. It was an institution. It could make decisions fast, adapt in the field, absorb losses, and keep moving in ways that neither Byzantine nor Persian armies could match. And the material incentives reinforced it perfectly. Conquered territory meant tribute. Tribute meant regular salaries. Salaries meant that fighters who had owned nothing in the desert suddenly had something to fight for and something to lose if they stopped. Faith and money, ideology and interest. That combination, meeting a world of hollow empires, was the formula for everything that came next. Muhammad died in 632. No clear successor, no designated heir. Within days, the entire structure threatened to collapse. Major tribes declared that their loyalty had been personal. It died with the man. They stopped paying the religious tax. Rival prophets emerged. The political community that Muhammad had spent 20 years building was cracking at every seam. Abu Bakr stepped into that vacuum. He was elected caliph, successor, through tense, difficult negotiation. Older, quiet, not a soldier by temperament, but he made the one decision that made everything else possible. He launched the Ridda Wars, the wars of apostasy. For 2 years, he sent his armies across Arabia to crush every rebellion, every secession, every rival claim. Brutal, systematic, unrelenting. By 634, Arabia was unified under one authority for the first time in its history. But that unification created an immediate crisis he had not planned for. He now commanded a large, battle-hardened, combat-experienced army, and the desert economy could not absorb it. You cannot tell men who have spent 2 years at war to go back to herding camels. They will find something else to fight. Each other, if necessary. The only solution: point them outward. Small raiding parties were already probing the Byzantine and Persian frontiers. What came back from those early probes was not expected. The defenses were barely there. Byzantine border troops, many of them Ghassanid Arabs, were surrendering or switching sides. Persian garrisons, unpaid and demoralized, were collapsing. Abu Bakr read the reports. He redirected the army. He died in 634, 2 years into what he started. He never saw how far it would go. But the machinery was moving, and it was already moving faster than anyone had imagined possible. Umar ibn al-Khattab was not glamorous. He did not lead cavalry charges. He did not write poetry in the field. He was a tall, direct, sometimes terrifying man who managed the most rapid territorial expansion in human history from a modest city in western Arabia, using riders and letters and a system of governance he invented from scratch as the conquests unfolded. He understood something that most conquerors never figure out. Winning battles is the easy part. Holding what you've won is where empires die. When Umar became caliph in 634, his armies were already fighting on 2 fronts simultaneously: Byzantium in Syria, Persia in Iraq. Any reasonable strategist would have picked one and consolidated. Umar understood that the window was closing. Both empires were weak now, in this specific moment. Delay was recovery. He kept both campaigns active, and as territory fell, he solved the occupation problem with solutions that seemed almost counterintuitive at the time. He forbade Arab soldiers from owning agricultural land in conquered provinces. They could not settle. They could not become a civilian population with nothing military left to offer. Instead, he built garrison cities, Amsar, at strategic points, Basra and Kufa in Iraq, Fustat in Egypt. Arab fighters lived there, paid regular salaries drawn from provincial tax revenue, and remained mobile. The conquered populations kept their religions, their laws, their lands. They paid the jizya, the non-Muslim poll tax, and in exchange received protection and order. This was not compassion. It was engineering. A population that can live its life does not revolt. A population in permanent revolt drains armies you need somewhere else. He created the Diwan, a military register recording every soldier's name, tribe, and entitlement to spoils. Plunder became payroll. Chaos became administration. Under Umar, the expansion was not a wave. It was a system. And then there was Khalid ibn al-Walid. Before you understand what happened at Yarmouk, you need to understand Khalid. He had once fought against Muhammad, commanded the cavalry that nearly destroyed the Muslim army at the Battle of Uhud in 625. Then he converted, switched sides, and the Muslim military suddenly possessed the finest battlefield commander in the Arab world. More than 100 engagements, undefeated. Not through luck, but through a specific and terrifying ability. He could read a battlefield while it was happening, identify the critical point, move before the enemy understood what he was seeing, strike the decisive blow before the moment closed. In 633, His armies in Iraq needed to link up with Arab forces already pushing into Byzantine Syria. The direct route was impassable, hundreds of miles of waterless Syrian desert in summer. Khalid loaded his men onto camels packed with water. When the water ran out, he slaughtered the camels and used water stored in their stomachs. He emerged in Syria within days. Byzantine commanders had no intelligence on his movement. He had materialized, apparently, from the desert itself. But Khalid had a problem that had nothing to do with the enemy. He was too popular. His men followed him personally. They called him Saif Allah, the sword of God. And that kind of allegiance, loyalty to a man rather than to a cause, was precisely what Umar could not allow. If the army fought for Khalid, then the army was Khalid's army. What held it together when Khalid died? What was the institution without the personality? In 634, at the peak of Arab military success, Umar stripped Khalid of supreme command. He gave it to Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, competent, loyal, and blessedly uncharismatic. Khalid was ordered to serve under him. He obeyed. He kept fighting. He kept winning. But the recognition never came back. He died years later, not on a battlefield, but in a bed, the sword of God, rusting in obscurity. There is a story, possibly apocryphal, that on his deathbed he looked at his own body, scarred from decades of combat, and wept. Not because he was dying, but because he was dying like this, in bed, like a camel. What Umar did to Khalid was one of history's quiet masterstrokes. He sacrificed the most dangerous instrument he possessed to protect the institution. He was right to do it. But Khalid's story matters for another reason. His greatest battle was still ahead, and Umar had kept him close enough to fight it. By the summer of 636, Heraclius understood. This was not a raid. Arab forces had been in Syria for 3 years, taking cities, organizing administration, collecting taxes. They were not going home. This was not a border problem. This was an existential threat. He assembled his response. The largest Byzantine military force in a generation. Roman regulars, Armenian heavy cavalry, Slavic mercenary infantry, and, critically, a large force of Ghassanid Arab cavalry. Christian Arabs who had guarded Byzantium's eastern frontier for 2 centuries and knew the terrain as well as any man alive. Modern estimates put the total force somewhere between 15,000 and 40,000 effective fighters. Formidable, expensive. Heraclius had committed everything. The armies met in the valley of the Yarmouk River, the border region between what is now Syria and Jordan. August, brutally hot. Dry plateau winds carrying dust from the east. The Byzantine commander positioned his force with the Yarmouk's deep gorge at his back. That decision would cost him everything. For 6 days, the armies fought. And here is what the numbers miss. The Byzantine army was not a unified force. It was a coalition. Roman officers gave orders in Latin. Armenian cavalrymen responded in Armenian. Ghassanid Arabs communicated with their own commanders through their own channels. Coordinating those forces under pressure, redirecting a cavalry wing, reinforcing a collapsing sector, responding to a sudden attack on the flank, required communication speed and command unity that simply did not exist. The Arab force was different. Flat command structure, shared language, shared ideology. When a decision needed to be made on the Arab side, it was made. When the same decision needed to be made on the Byzantine side, it needed to travel up 4 different chains of command and come back down. On the 3rd day, Byzantine cavalry punched through the Arab left flank. For a moment, A real, terrifying moment. The Arab line buckled. A gap opened. If it held, the battle might pivot. Khalid saw it. Still officially serving under Abu Ubaidah. Still technically a subordinate. But no one else on that field had his eye. He rode into the gap personally, leading his cavalry reserve in a countercharge that hit the Byzantine breakthrough before it could widen. The gap closed. The line held. 4 days of attrition followed. Then the sandstorm. It came from the desert, out of the east, sweeping across the plateau with the force that only the Syrian summer can produce. It hit the Byzantine lines in the face, blinding, suffocating, disorienting. The Arab forces, wind at their backs, pressed forward through the dust. And in that moment, the Ghassanid cavalry, the Christian Arabs who had served Byzantium for generations, who were now looking across the line at men who shared their blood and increasingly their faith, broke. Not in panic, in decision. They refused to fight. The Byzantine cohesion, already stretched to its limit, snapped. What had been a fighting retreat became a rout. Men fled toward the gorge behind them, the gorge that the Byzantine commander had thought was a defensive anchor. It was a killing ground. Soldiers fell into the ravines. The retreat turned into a catastrophe. Heraclius received the news in Antioch. He did not return south. He issued orders for the complete withdrawal of all imperial forces from Syria. The provinces were abandoned. Then he boarded his ship for Constantinople. Standing at the harbor, he reportedly turned south one final time. "Farewell, Syria," he said. "What an excellent country this is for the enemy." Whether he actually said those words is uncertain. The meaning is exact. He understood in that moment what he was looking at. Not a temporary setback, not a border war that would resolve itself. This was a permanent transfer of the world. Within 2 years, Jerusalem itself fell, not by assault, but by negotiation. The patriarch Sophronius opened the gates. Umar came personally, on a camel, wearing plain clothing. He signed an agreement guaranteeing Christian residents their churches, their worship, their property. He refused to pray inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, so it would remain, unambiguously, a Christian place. It was an act of extraordinary political calculation. An occupation that lets people live their lives generates compliance. Compliance frees the army for the next campaign. Palestine was organized, Egypt was next. While Yarmouk was being fought in the west, something equally consequential was happening 700 miles to the east. At almost the exact same time, late 636, early 637, an Arab army under Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas crushed the main Persian military force at Al-Qadisiyah on the Euphrates. The battle lasted 4 days. The Persian commander, Rustam Farrokhzad, one of the last great Sassanid generals, died in the fighting. His army disintegrated. Persia had no contingency, no second line of defense. The Sassanid Empire was organized around a single center, the court at Ctesiphon, the great capital on the Tigris. When the army was broken, there was nothing behind it. Arab forces crossed the Euphrates and found the capital abandoned. The emperor, Yazdegerd III, last of the Sassanids, had fled east. He spent the rest of his life running, east through the Persian heartland, further east into Khorasan. He sent letters to the Tang Emperor of China, begging for military intervention. The letters were received politely. No army came. In 651, Yazdegerd was murdered by a local miller in a dispute near the city of Merv, robbed for the clothes on his back. The greatest dynasty of the Eastern world did not end in a last stand. It ended in a ditch, beside a river, in a province no one controlled. Within 15 years of Yarmouk, the Sassanid Empire, 400 years of continuous civilization, had ceased to exist. Not conquered, erased. This was not how conquest usually worked. Most ancient conquests changed who sat at the top. The administrative structure continued. The aristocracy converted or made accommodations. Life went on under new management. What happened to Persia was different. The bureaucracy collapsed. The Zoroastrian priesthood lost its institutional support. The aristocratic families dispersed or died. A civilization that had produced great art, architecture, literature, and statecraft simply stopped functioning as a coherent unit. But here is the irony that runs through everything. The armies that erased Persian civilization were also absorbing it. Persian administrative expertise, Persian tax collection methods, Persian literary culture, Persian scientific knowledge, all of it was being integrated into the caliphate even as the Sassanid state dissolved. Within a century, Persian-speaking scholars would be the intellectual backbone of Islamic civilization. The conquered became, in the most important ways, the teachers of the conqueror. In 644, Umar ibn al-Khattab, the man who had built the system that made the expansion possible, was stabbed in the mosque at Medina while leading morning prayers. A Persian slave, nursing a private grievance. 6 wounds. Umar lingered for 3 days. In those 3 days, he refused to name his successor. He said it was not his place to bind the community to a choice it had not made for itself. He died still organizing the transition. His death was the first crack. What followed was not immediate catastrophe. The third caliph, Uthman ibn Affan, was elected through the council Umar established. He was a decent man. His administration was, in many respects, competent. But he made choices that accumulated, year by year, into pressure that the system could not contain. He distributed the most powerful positions in the empire: governor of Syria, governor of Egypt, governor of Basra, predominantly to his own clan, the Umayyads, a family that had been among the last in Mecca to accept Islam, a family that the earliest believers had reason to distrust. Veterans of the first campaigns felt cheated. Garrison troops who had been promised equal distribution of spoils watched the wealth flow elsewhere. The resentment built quietly. Then it didn't build quietly anymore. In 656, soldiers from Egypt and Iraq marched on Medina. They surrounded Uthman's house. Negotiations collapsed. They broke through the door. They found him reading the Quran. They killed him there. The first caliph murdered by Muslims, not by enemies of the faith, by men who believed, with complete sincerity, that they were defending it. What followed was civil war. Ali ibn Abi Talib, Muhammad's cousin, his son-in-law, arguably the man with the strongest personal claim to leadership from the very beginning, became the 4th caliph. The community split immediately. Aisha, Muhammad's widow, a woman of enormous political authority, opposed him. She believed Uthman's killers needed justice, and she suspected Ali's role in creating the conditions for the murder. Her forces met Ali's at the Battle of the Camel in 656. She directed the battle from a litter on a camel's back, surrounded by fighting men. Ali won. Aisha was captured, treated with respect, and removed from politics permanently. Then there was Muawiyah. Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan was the governor of Syria, Uthman's cousin, commander of the most powerful military force in the caliphate. He refused to recognize Ali's authority until Uthman's killers were punished. Ali refused to execute men who had helped bring him to power. The standoff hardened into war. Their armies met at the Battle of Siffin in 657 on the Euphrates and fought inconclusively for months. When arbitration was proposed, Ali accepted it, and that acceptance destroyed him. His most zealous supporters, the Kharijites, declared that accepting human arbitration of a divine matter was apostasy. They abandoned his army. Some of them tried to kill him. In 661, one succeeded. A Kharijite struck Ali with a poisoned sword in the mosque at Kufa. He died 2 days later. 3 of the first 4 caliphs had now been killed by Muslims. Muawiyah took power. He moved the capital to Damascus. He established the Umayyad dynasty and made the decision that changed the nature of the caliphate permanently. He designated his own son, Yazid, as his successor. The caliphate had been, in theory, an elected office. Muawiyah ended the theory. He turned it into a monarchy, practical, politically necessary, and permanently, irreparably alienating to everyone who believed that leadership of the Muslim community belonged with the descendants of the Prophet. The wound cut into this moment, between Muawiyah's decision and those who refused to accept it, would never fully close. It is the wound that eventually becomes Sunni and Shia Islam. The first fitna was over. The expansion resumed. But it was a different enterprise now. Dynastic, state-directed, imperial rather than communal. The Umayyads brought greater resources and greater organizational capacity than the early caliphs had possessed. They built a navy. They standardized coinage. They staffed their bureaucracy with Syrian Christian administrators who already knew how to run a complex state. The machinery was upgraded, and the expansion accelerated. The Umayyads had a strategic problem. Twice they had sent massive naval expeditions to take the one city that would unlock the road into Europe from the east. Constantinople, the symbolic center of Byzantine power, the key to the Balkans, the gateway to Central Europe. If it fell, the Byzantine Empire was finished. The first siege ran from 674 to 678, the second in 717 to 718. Both failed. The first was broken by a Byzantine secret weapon, Greek fire, an incendiary substance projected through tubes mounted on warships that burned on water. Nothing in Arab or Persian naval technology had an answer to it. Arab ships burned in the Bosphorus. The fleet withdrew. The second siege was larger, better prepared, and ran for nearly a year. It failed because of Greek fire again, a Bulgarian army that struck the Arab besieging force from the landward side, and a winter so brutal it killed tens of thousands of men who were not equipped for it. Constantinople held. That fact, that single stubborn fact, redirected everything. If the eastern gate was locked, find the western one. The push through Spain was, in this light, not an impulsive raid. It was strategy, compensation for an eastern check that could not be broken. The Umayyads were methodically working around an obstacle. North Africa had fallen by 698. Arab and Berber forces reached the Atlantic coast of Morocco by around 710. They looked north across a strait barely 12 miles wide. On the other side, the Iberian Peninsula, the Visigothic kingdom of Spain, wealthy, fractured, and, crucially, politically divided. The Visigothic king, Rodrigo, had seized power in what may have been a coup. His legitimacy was contested. His enemies were looking for allies. Julian, the governor of Ceuta on the African coast, had his own reasons, personal, political, probably financial, to facilitate what came next. He arranged the boats. In the spring of 711, Tariq ibn Ziyad, a Berber commander, converted Muslim, a man of considerable military intelligence, crossed from Africa to Spain with approximately 7,000 men. He landed at a great rock on the southern tip of the peninsula. That rock now bears his name, Jabal Tariq, Gibraltar. Rodrigo marched south with his main army. They met at the Guadalete River in late July. The battle lasted 8 days. On the final day, the wings of Rodrigo's army, commanded by men who had opposed his seizure of power, defected. The center collapsed. Rodrigo died in the fighting. His body was never found. The Visigothic kingdom, 2 centuries old, effectively ceased to exist in a week. Tariq moved immediately. No consolidation, no pause. Toledo, the capital, fell with almost no resistance. Tariq's commander, Musa ibn Nusayr, crossed from Africa with a larger army and swept north and west. Within 3 years, Arab and Berber forces held most of the peninsula. Within a decade, only the mountainous north, the Asturian coast, the Cantabrian highlands, remained outside their control. They crossed the Pyrenees. They held Narbonne in southern France for 4 decades. Raid parties pushed as far north as Lyon, as far east as the Rhone Valley. Europe was open, or so it seemed. In the autumn of 732, Abd al-Rahman al-Jafiqi led his army north from Al-Andalus. He was not a raider. He was the Umayyad governor of Islamic Spain, a serious, experienced commander executing what was almost certainly deliberate strategic policy. The Umayyad court wanted permanent presence north of the Pyrenees. Raids were not enough. You needed fortified positions. You needed to break the Frankish capacity to resist before it organized. His army moved through Gascony, sacked Bordeaux, and turned northeast toward the Loire. The target was the Abbey of Saint-Martin at Tours, one of the wealthiest religious sites in Western Europe, a pilgrimage center, a symbol of Frankish Christian identity. Plundering it would strip the region of resources and strip the Franks of something harder to quantify: the sense that God was protecting them. Between Abd al-Rahman and Tours stood a man who was not technically a king. Charles Martel held the title of Mayor of the Palace, an administrative rank that understates reality entirely. He was the actual power in the Frankish kingdom, exercising authority in the name of a nominal Merovingian king with no real power. His position was real. His authority was contested. His political situation was genuinely difficult. He had just crushed a rebellion in Burgundy, faced Saxon pressure in the east, Frisian threats in the north, and internal Frankish nobility that was fractious, unreliable, and perpetually looking for an opening to challenge him. And now an army that had conquered half the known world was riding north toward the Loire. Charles did not panic. He calculated. He knew he could not beat Arab cavalry on open ground. That cavalry, fast, disciplined, experienced, the instrument of 100 years of successful conquest, would simply ride over any force he put in its way if the terrain favored it. He needed to take the cavalry advantage away. He moved through the Frankish heartland, called his forces together, heavy infantry mostly, armed with spears and battle axes, armored in mail, and chose his ground with precision. A wooded ridge near the confluence of the Vienne and Clown rivers, between Poitiers and Tours, where the tree line compressed any mounted advance into a narrow approach, and the slope removed the momentum that made cavalry devastating. He positioned his men. He told them to hold, and then he waited. Abd al-Rahman arrived and saw what Charles had done. He understood immediately that the terrain was wrong. His cavalry, the weapon that had broken every army from Damascus to the Garonne, could not operate in those wooded approaches. The speed that made it lethal was neutralized. The shock power that shattered formations was channeled into a narrow killing ground. He had two options: withdraw to better ground or assault. He chose assault, maybe because withdrawal looked like weakness to an army loaded with plunder and expecting victory. Maybe because he had never, in his career, encountered infantry that could actually hold. Maybe because the strategic situation demanded momentum. Retreating now would signal to every power in the region that the expansion could be stopped. And once that signal was sent, it could not be unsent. Whatever the calculation, he attacked. The cavalry came in waves, up the slope, into the Frankish shield wall, and the shield wall held. Arab chroniclers, describing what they saw from the other side, called the Frankish formation a wall of ice. Men who did not move, men who absorbed the charge, let it break around them, and closed the gaps. Horses fell on the slope. The surviving riders regrouped, reformed, and charged again. The Franks absorbed it again. This went on for days. Each charge that failed cost Abd al-Rahman men and horses that could not be quickly replaced. Each day that passed without a breakthrough meant his army was consuming its supplies in enemy territory, far from any base of support. The strategic math was turning against him, but he kept attacking, because stopping meant admitting that the wall could not be broken, and admitting that was something he could not afford. Then came the moment that ended it. Frankish scouts, or a small cavalry detachment, the sources are uncertain, worked around the Arab flank and reached Abd al-Rahman's camp. The plunder, the supply train, the rear area where the army's wealth was stored. The alarm went through his lines like a crack through ice. Part of the Arab force broke formation instinctively to protect the camp. The line that had been holding began to fracture. Abd al-Rahman rode to restore it, riding into the chaos, trying to pull his men back into order through sheer force of presence and command. Somewhere in that chaos, he was killed. The sources disagree on the specifics. He went in. He did not come out. When an army loses its commander in the middle of a disintegrating battle, everything depends on whether the second tier of leadership can hold the structure together. In a force as dependent on personal authority as Abd al-Rahman's, the answer was no. Different contingents defaulted to their own judgment. Some fought on, others began withdrawing. The withdrawal became general. By nightfall, the army was moving south. Charles deployed at dawn the next morning. He found an empty camp, tents left standing, equipment abandoned, and the plunder that Abd al-Rahman's men had been fighting to protect, left behind in the retreat. He did not pursue. He had no cavalry to run them down, and his infantry had nothing left to give. But the restraint was also something else: strategic intelligence. The Arabs had not been destroyed. They had been stopped. Running after them with exhausted foot soldiers into territory you didn't control was how defensive victories became catastrophes. He stayed. He held the field. He was the last man standing. Tours was over. Here is where most narratives about Tours get it wrong. Tours did not save Christian Europe. That story, clean, dramatic, morally satisfying, is largely a Carolingian political narrative that later historians elevated into historical law. The reality is more complex and more interesting. The Umayyad Caliphate did not collapse after Tours. It remained one of the most powerful states in the world. Arab forces held Narbonne in southern France for another 27 years, until 759. Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, would endure for another 7 centuries. The reconquest of Iberia would not conclude until 1492, 781 years after Tariq crossed the strait. What Tours ended was momentum. Specifically, the political will to push deeper into Frankish territory, at a moment when the Umayyad Caliphate was beginning to buckle under its own contradictions. Those contradictions were severe. The conquest had been built on a promise. Expansion generates wealth. Wealth is distributed to all participants. When expansion slowed, the promise became harder to keep. The Berbers of North Africa, who had provided much of the manpower for the conquest of Spain, who had been told they were equal members of the Islamic community, found themselves paying taxes that Arab settlers did not. They found their best lands taken by Arab elites. They found that the equality promised by the faith was not reflected in the political structure of the state. In 740, they revolted. The Great Berber Revolt swept across North Africa with a speed and ferocity that the Umayyad Caliphate struggled to contain. It cost them years of military effort and permanent loss of control over large parts of the Maghreb. Then, in 750, the dynasty itself fell. A revolution based in Khorasan, the old Persian heartland, brought the Abbasid family to power. The revolution was religious in its rhetoric, ethnic in its energy, and political in its execution. Nearly every member of the Umayyad family was hunted down and killed. One escaped. Abd al-Rahman I rode west, survived the Mediterranean, reached Spain, and founded an independent emirate at Córdoba that would endure for 2.5 centuries on its own terms. The Abbasids moved the capital to Baghdad, a new city built deliberately near the ruins of Ctesiphon, the old Persian capital. The message was intentional. This caliphate would be Persian as much as Arab. The center of gravity of the Islamic world shifted east, and the Golden Age began. Greek philosophical texts were translated into Arabic and extended. Al-Khwarizmi wrote the foundational texts of algebra. Ibn Sina, Avicenna, produced a medical encyclopedia that European universities used for 600 years. Astronomers in Baghdad calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy. The Islamic world was, for several centuries, the most intellectually productive civilization on the planet. While Western Europe was struggling to maintain basic literacy in the wake of Roman collapse, Baghdad was running libraries, hospitals, observatories, and institutions of higher learning. The expansion had not merely taken territory, it had built a world. And in the West, the man who had stopped that expansion had also, without fully understanding it, started something. Charles Martel's victory confirmed the political dominance of the Carolingian family in Francia. His son Pippin deposed the last Merovingian king in 751 with papal blessing. And Pippin's son, Charles, known to history as Charlemagne, was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day, 800. A new Rome, a new Europe, built on the ground that the expansion had failed to cross. The boundary the Arab armies reached became one of the most durable dividing lines in human history. The Mediterranean, once the center of a unified Roman world, an inland sea connecting cultures, became a divided sea. Christian north, Islamic south. The consequences compounded over a millennium. Diverging legal systems, different languages of intellectual life, separate trade networks, distinct political philosophies, competing claims to universal truth. The Crusades of the 11th century were, among other things, an attempt to reverse what had happened at Yarmouk and after, to reassert Christian presence in lands the expansion had permanently taken. They mostly failed. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks, heirs in many ways to the Umayyad and Abbasid military tradition, closed the last chapter of a story that had begun when Heraclius stood at a harbor in Antioch and said farewell. And the final reconquest of Spain in January 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella's armies entering Granada, closed the western chapter that had opened when Tariq ibn Ziyad looked north across 12 miles of open water and decided to cross. Two things are true about the Arab expansion, and both need to be true at the same time. First, the expansion succeeded not because of Arab strength. It succeeded because of imperial exhaustion. Yarmouk was not won because the Arab army was invincible. It was won because the Byzantine army was a coalition of men from different nations, speaking different languages, fighting for different reasons, whose command coherence collapsed under sustained pressure. Al-Qadisiyah was not won because Arab soldiers were individually superior to Persian soldiers. It was won because the Sassanid Empire had spent a decade destroying its own institutional loyalty in internal succession wars. The Arab expansion did not conquer a healthy world. It moved through a world that had already, quietly, fallen apart. The genius of Umar, and of Abu Bakr before him, was seeing that window clearly and moving through it with ruthless speed before it closed. Second, every great expansion carries the seeds of its own end. The same decentralized, ideologically charged, incentive-driven structure that made Arab armies so difficult to stop in open warfare, that let them operate without heavy supply chains, absorb casualties and keep moving, maintain cohesion across vast distances without centralized communication, was the same structure that made political stability nearly impossible once the momentum slowed. The first fitna proved it. The Great Berber Revolt proved it again. The Abbasid Revolution was its final proof. The limits at Constantinople and Tours were not accidents. They were the places where the structural logic of the expansion, fast, mobile, cavalry-dominant, optimized for collapsing opponents in open terrain, ran into conditions it was not built for. Greek fire in the Bosphorus. Frankish heavy infantry on a wooded ridge, refusing to move. The expansion stopped not because the Islamic world was defeated. It stopped because it ran into things it could not overcome, at the exact moment its internal contradictions had become too large to ignore. In October of 732, Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi pushed too far, into the wrong terrain, against a man who had chosen his ground with cold deliberation and built a wall of men and iron to hold it. Abd al-Rahman died in the attempt. His army retreated south in the night. Charles Martel stood on his ridge in the gray October morning and looked at an empty camp. He did not know in that moment what he had become. He did not know his grandson would be crowned emperor. He did not know that a boundary had just been drawn that would hold, in its essential shape, for centuries. He knew only that the field was his, and that the men who had come to take it were gone. He turned his horse east, toward the Saxons, toward the next problem, toward the next war. History does not pause for its own significance. It simply continues. What had begun in the deserts of Arabia 100 years earlier, that extraordinary, terrifying, world-altering surge of energy and organization and belief, had finally found its edge. Not a wall, not a defeat, not a God-given verdict. Just the place where momentum ended, and the long, complicated work of living with what had been built, on both sides of that line, began. You are a senior YouTube history scriptwriter specializing in cinematic, long-form documentary content. Your scripts consistently achieve above-average audience retention through narrative tension, clear causality, and cinematic pacing, not through shock, sensationalism, or filler. I will give you a video title from a historical series on early medieval power and conflict. Your task: write a complete YouTube script in American English. Cinematic, immersive, intelligent, no textbook tone, no bullet point structure in the final script. And so the story closes. But hey, if you're still here right now, still watching at this point in the video, that tells me something. Something in this story touched you. Maybe it was Elena's quiet strength, the girl who worked twice as hard and still doubted herself. Maybe it was Nathan, a man so afraid of being hurt that he built walls and called them wisdom. Or maybe it was just the feeling of watching two people finally stop pretending and choose to be real with each other. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Elena didn't find love by becoming someone else. She found it by refusing to shrink. And Nathan didn't open up because the world became safer. He opened up because one person made being real feel worth the risk. That's the lesson, friends. Self-sufficiency is a survival skill. But chosen vulnerability? That's courage. You are not too much. You are not too little. You are not the girl from the wrong neighborhood or the man who waited too long. You are exactly enough. For the right person, at the right moment, when you finally stop performing and just show up as yourself. If this story moved you even a little, drop a comment below. Tell me which moment hit hardest. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe and hit that bell. Every single one of you showing up here makes this worth creating. See you in the next story. A quick note before you go, and I want to be completely honest with you, because you deserve that. This is a fictional story, created for entertainment and emotional storytelling. Elena, Nathan, Derek, and every character you met today are not real people. The events, the companies, the conversations, all of it was crafted by our creative team to give you an experience worth your time. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is entirely coincidental. The locations mentioned, Central Park, the Plaza, Park Avenue, are real places, used only as storytelling backdrop to bring the world of the story to life. We create these stories because we believe in the power of narrative to help people feel seen, process their own experiences, and find meaning in shared human emotions. That mission is always honest, even when the story itself is fiction. Thank you for trusting us with your time. That trust is never something we take lightly. With love, your storytelling team.